The Serafina Club sat like a jeweled crown atop the 28th floor, its windows stretching so wide that the entire city seemed to kneel beneath them in a carpet of flickering lights. Outside, the wind carried the restless honk of taxis and the faint metallic squeal of subway rails. Inside, however, the noise of the world was hushed by thick crystal panes. The ballroom smelled of lilies imported from some distant greenhouse, polished wood wax, and a dozen perfumes too expensive to be sold with price tags. The air was heavy, warm, and saturated with old money's sense of permanence, as if the walls themselves sneered at the thought of change. For the guests, this was not merely a restaurant, but a playground where fortunes toasted fortunes. For the staff, it was another night of holding their spines straight, their smiles smoother than porcelain, and their presence as quiet as shadows. The rules of this place were simple. Be quick, be silent, be invisible. Among those shadows moved Laura Vance. At 24, she carried herself with a grace that didn't quite fit the stiff black uniform. Her eyes, wide and dark, suggested oceans of stories no guest would ever pause to hear. In her hands, a tray of champagne flutes trembled only slightly, steadied by practice and necessity. Every dollar she earned here made its way across town, into the sterile hallways of a nursing facility where her mother, Maria, fought a disease that was slowly devouring her memory and her body alike. Laura's true inheritance had not been money or privilege, but a voice, a soprano that once promised a stage at Juilliard, bright lights, velvet curtains. But dreams, like fruit left too long in the sun, had withered under the weight of hospital invoices and overdue rent. So Lara sang to herself now, late at night, quietly, when no one could hear, while by day she performed the more grueling role of the smiling help. The Serafina's grand ballroom glowed beneath chandeliers carved to look like falling stars. Beneath their golden light sat the Blackwoods, at the very center, as if the world were arranged around them. Richard Blackwood, titan of finance, leaned toward his Korean guests, Mr. and Mrs. Lee, his silver hair catching the light like a crown forged from frost. His wife, Eleanor, was a sculpture of diamonds and ice, her gown rigid enough to slice the air around her. Julian, their son, stretched in his seat with the arrogance of a man who had never heard the word no spoken sincerely. The event was dressed as a celebration of Julian's engagement to Isabella de la Cruz. But behind the champagne and the string quartet, everyone knew the true star of the evening was the billion-dollar merger Richard was sealing with the Lees. For him, this was not just business. It was the culmination of a life spent trading melodies for money, although no one else in the room knew that part of his story. Laura moved closer, carrying a chilled bottle of Dom Perignon, beads of condensation running down the green glass. Her shoes sank soundlessly into the thick carpet as she approached their table. The weight of 100 watching eyes pressed down on her, though most barely noticed her existence. She was not meant to be seen, only to serve. Finally, Eleanor said, her voice carrying like a blade across the polished table. One might think the vineyard was being cultivated tonight. Julian smirked, stretching his legs into the aisle like a boy laying traps. Mother, you must forgive them. Good help is rarer than truffles these days. His laugh spread like a bad smell, inviting others at the table to join in. Heat climbed Laura's neck, but her face remained the practiced porcelain mask. "My apologies, ma'am," she whispered, her voice controlled, clipped. She tilted the bottle carefully, filling Richard's glass first, then moving around the table with precision. Richard did not glance up. His entire attention was tethered to the lees, his voice as smooth as oiled mahogany. "Our combined assets will create a platform no competitor could rival," he said, his tone warm but calculated, his eyes sharp. To him, Lara was no more present than the linen beneath his elbows. When she reached Isabella, the young woman looked up, offering a smile too fragile to be real. Her hazel eyes held the trapped shimmer of someone accustomed to silence. For the briefest second, empathy flickered there, an unspoken apology that hung between them like a secret thread. Julian shattered it. "Careful, waitress," he drawled, watching Lara angle the bottle over his glass. "This is Tom Ford. Costs more than your year's wages. I'd rather you didn't christen it with champagne." "Yes, sir," Lara murmured, her hands steady though her stomach lurched. She poured with surgical precision, tilting the bottle back without spilling a drop. But as she straightened, Julian shifted ever so slightly in his chair, his polished shoe catching her ankle. The stumble was small, but enough. The heavy bottle slipped from her damp fingers. It landed on the carpet with a muffled thud, but the spray of champagne leapt high, splattering across the pristine tablecloth and most disastrously streaking Eleanor's silk sleeve. The ballroom stilled. Conversations died like candles snuffed in a storm. Every head turned. Eleanor rose slowly, staring at the spreading stain as if someone had slashed her arm open. Her voice, low and venomous, cracked the silence. "You clumsy, incompetent girl. Do you even know what this dress is worth? It's couture, irreplaceable. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Blackwood." It was an accident. Lara reached for a napkin, but Eleanor snapped her hand away as if burned. "Don't touch me," Eleanor hissed, her fury echoing in the stunned quiet. "Richard, do something. This humiliation. At our table." Julian leaned back, his smirk wide, enjoying the spectacle. "See, Mother? This is what happens when we let just anyone in from the street." Richard finally turned his attention from the lees, his gaze slicing toward the disturbance. Annoyance darkened his features. He did not address Lara. She was beneath his notice. Instead, he spoke to Mr. Davies, the anxious club manager hurrying toward them. "Control your staff. We are conducting business. This interruption is intolerable. Dock her wages for damages." Davies bowed his head quickly. "My sincerest apologies, Mr. Blackwood. Mrs. Blackwood. It will be handled at once." He took Lara's arm, gentle but firm, and steered her toward the staff corridor. Shame blistered beneath her skin. It wasn't only the spilled champagne or the biting humiliation. It was the smug curl of Julian's lips, the cold dismissal in Richard's voice, Eleanor's theatrical outrage. She knew Julian had tripped her. But here, in this fortress of money, truth carried no weight. Power spoke louder than fact. From behind them, Eleanor's voice still cut through the air, dripping disdain. The quality of people these days. No grace, no breeding. One wonders where they even come from. The words pierced deeper than the champagne had stained. Where they come from. Lara's hand instinctively rose to the silver locket hidden beneath her uniform. Inside was a faded photograph. Her mother's youthful face on one side, and on the other, a man she had never met. A musician named Rick, whom her mother had loved and lost long ago. In the corridor's sterile light, Davies released her arm. His voice softened, almost paternal. "Don't let them break you, Lara. They're vipers. I saw Julian trip you, but we can't prove it. Just take a few minutes. Compose yourself. I'll smooth things over. Lara nodded mutely, though inside her chest something twisted, a heat coiling tighter with every breath. She splashed cold water on her face at the sink, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of bleach clinging to the tiles. For years she had told herself swallowing pride was strength. Tonight, Eleanor's sneer, Julian's cruelty, Richard's dismissal, they didn't just humiliate her. They mocked her mother's sacrifices, the dignity she had carried through a life of suffering. As Lara pressed her palms flat against the sink, water dripping from her chin, the mask of the deferential waitress began to fracture. Behind her eyes, the fire was spreading. The clamor of the ballroom seeped faintly through the heavy walls, muffled as if the city's elite were no more than ghosts conversing in another dimension. Lara lingered in the corridor, her reflection staring back from the stainless steel panel of a service door. The girl in that reflection looked drained, the faint smudge of champagne still drying on her cuff, her hair pulled too tight. Yet beneath the surface she saw something else, an ember, faint but insistent, waiting for air. Davies had retreated, promising to patch over the disaster, to soothe Eleanor with apologies and vouchers of compensation. Lara knew the script. It had been performed countless times. The powerful misstepped, the powerless absorbed the punishment. The world marched on, indifferent. Still, tonight felt different. Eleanor's words lingered like acid. One wonders where they even come from. Where she came from was a modest two-bedroom walk-up that smelled of camphor rub and overcooked rice. Where she came from was the sterile whiteness of hospital corridors. Her mother's trembling hands clasping hers as she whispered stories of a man named Rick who could make a guitar weep. Where she came from was not disgrace, but survival. Yet Eleanor's voice had made it sound like filth. She straightened her shoulders. The locket rested warm against her skin, a small anchor. They think I'm invisible, she thought. But even shadows can move if the light shifts just right. Back in the ballroom, the machine of wealth had sputtered only briefly before resuming its steady hum. Staff replaced the stained cloth with swift precision. Orchids shifted to conceal the mishap, and fresh flutes of champagne materialized as though summoned by magic. The jazz trio played something lively, trying to scrub away the awkward pause. To the guests, it was a hiccup in the script, a moment to be forgotten beneath the gloss of luxury. Richard leaned once more toward the Lees, his voice even, rehearsed. A minor disturbance, he murmured smoothly. These things happen. Now about the third quarter projections. But Mr. Lee had seen the entire exchange. He had watched Julian's leg shift, had caught Eleanor's fury flaring far beyond proportion, had noted Richard's icy indifference. In his culture, respect was a currency more enduring than any stock. What he had witnessed was not respect. It was contempt dressed in designer silk. Though he offered Richard a polite nod, his mind recorded a tally in ink too permanent to erase. In the staff corridor, Lara rubbed her palms together, trying to still their tremor. The antiseptic tang of bleach filled her nostrils. A dishwasher rattled faintly somewhere down the hall, clinking like nervous teeth. She whispered to herself, not an apology, not an excuse, but a promise. She re-entered the ballroom cautiously, not towards the Blackwoods table, but to the periphery. From a service station near the entrance, she observed them as if studying a species behind glass. Eleanor preened, her hand possessive on Richard's sleeve. Julian leaned close to Isabella, whose posture sagged like a caged bird too tired to resist. Richard maintained his practiced calm, but when his gaze wandered unguarded, Lara noticed the faint tapping of his fingers on the linen, a rhythm complex and oddly musical, as though an old habit still lived in the bones of his hands. Her mother's voice echoed in memory. He wrote me a song, called it The Willow's Lament, said I was like the willow tree, graceful, bending, but never breaking. Could the man at that table, the titan whose name could tilt markets, have once been Rick, a penniless musician with a cheap guitar? The thought felt absurd, yet the tapping of his fingers, the haunted look that flickered in rare moments, pulled at her like a half-forgotten melody. She gripped her tray tighter, pulse hammering. Julian noticed her then. From across the room, he lifted his hand, curling his fingers in a summons meant to look casual, but dripping with command. Lara's stomach clenched. Refusing meant termination, perhaps worse, blacklisting from every high-end establishment in the city. So she approached, her steps measured, her face again the porcelain mask. "Yes, sir," she said evenly. Julian's smirk widened. "We were having a debate," he announced, loud enough for the table to hear. "Mother insists that people in your line of work have no ambition. I, however, believe you must have dreams. Tell me," his eyes glittered with malice, "what does a girl like you dream about at night? A uniform with fewer stains? A bigger tip jar?" The table chuckled, sycophantic laughter filling the pauses. Isabella stared at her lap, knuckles white around her clutch. Mr. Lee's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Lara's heart thudded. Heat crawled up her throat, not from shame this time, but from something sharper. She looked not at Julian but straight at Richard, whose gaze now shifted to her with irritation at yet another disturbance. Her voice came clear, steady, surprising even herself. "I dream of a time when a person's worth isn't measured by the price of their suit." Julian's smirk faltered. "Why, you insolent little—" But she didn't stop. "And I dream of music, of stages and concert halls, of songs that tell the truth." Eleanor scoffed loudly. "A songbird in an apron. How quaint. Can you even carry a tune? Or is that another clumsy delusion?" Something in Lara snapped taut. The challenge was clear. She felt the ember inside flare into a flame. Without another word, she turned and began to walk toward the stage. Conversations wavered. Heads turned. A murmur rippled across the ballroom. The waitress was walking onto the stage. Was it some planned entertainment? Julian's harsh laugh cracked the air. "What is this? Will she juggle for us next?" Eleanor hissed at Richard, panic rising. "Do something. The Lees are watching. This is a disaster." But Richard did not move. His eyes followed Lara with an expression almost unreadable. Irritation, yes, but beneath it, something unsettled, a ghost tugging at memory. The stage loomed ahead, lit in a warm cone of amber light. The microphone stood gleaming on its stand, unattended, like a scepter waiting for its claimant. Lara's steps rang softly against the polished wood as she ascended. The murmurs died into silence. 200 eyes fixed on her. She closed her eyes, inhaled, and for a moment, she was no longer in the Serafina Club, but at her mother's bedside, Maria's frail hand clasping hers, whispering about Rick and the willow tree that bent but never broke. When she opened her eyes, her gaze locked once more on Richard Blackwood. Her fingers closed around the microphone. The cool metal hummed against her skin, and she began to sing. The first note hung in the air like a spark catching dry grass. It was no timid sound, no nervous warble from a servant overstepping her station. It was clear, pure, and startlingly powerful. A soprano so finely honed it made the crystal glasses on the tables hum in sympathy. Heads jerked up. Forks froze midair. Even the cynical string players near the wall leaned forward, bowing arms slack at their sides. Lara Vance stood beneath the golden wash of the stage lights, her black work shoes anchored to the polished boards as though rooted. The microphone trembled only slightly in her hand, though inside her chest a storm roared. She had never sung in a ballroom full of billionaires and their bored spouses. She had never sung outside the safety of her bedroom walls since her mother's illness swallowed the last of her dreams. And yet, here she was, singing not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. The room shifted. The laughter that had been Julian's weapon sputtered and died in his throat. The smirk that had danced across his lips faltered into something tighter, something close to disbelief. Eleanor clutched the edge of the tablecloth, eyes wide with outrage that her carefully choreographed evening had been hijacked by a waitress. Richard Blackwood leaned back slowly, shoulders stiff, eyes narrowed, a man confronted not by a servant's insolence, but by a sound he had not expected to hear again in his lifetime. The melody was familiar, haunting, the willow's lament. Lara's mother had whispered of it for years, speaking of it as if it were a relic from another world. The tune was soaked in longing, the kind of sorrow that seeped into wood and stone, carried on the backs of rainstorms. Every word Lara sang seemed to summon a ghost into the room. The willow bends beneath the storm, a promise whispered to keep me warm. Her voice unfurled like silk torn from an old chest, both fragile and fierce. And with every note, the air thickened. Perfume could not mask the sharp tang of fear rising at the blackwood table. A woman in emeralds near the front clutched her pearls, whispering, "She can actually sing." Somewhere toward the back, a man laughed nervously as though hoping the sound would puncture the tension. It did not. Richard Blackwood's wineglass trembled between his fingers. The sound yanked him back across decades, into a memory he had sealed away beneath contracts and corner offices. He saw rain-streaked windows in a cramped apartment, the curve of Maria's smile as she lay across a narrow bed, dark hair spilling over his guitar case. He heard his younger self, Rick, not Richard, promising forever through chords scratched on cheap strings. And now here, in this gleaming fortress of power, that forgotten vow had come back to life, carried on the voice of a young woman who should not have known it. His pulse hammered against his ribs. Sweat prickled beneath his starched collar. He dropped his gaze to the table, but the sound followed him, merciless. Eleanor noticed. "Richard," she hissed under her breath, voice sharp as broken glass. "Control this madness. The Lees are watching." But Richard could not move. His fingers tapped the linen, almost involuntarily, mapping the guitar chords he had not played in decades. Julian tried to regain ground. "Charming," he said loudly, forcing laughter. "Our entertainment has decided to add a sideshow. Mother, shall we clap when she's done? Or call security now?" But his voice wavered. Isabella, sitting beside him, did not laugh. Her hazel eyes glistened, her hands twisting the clutch in her lap until the knuckles blanched white. The song's words struck her, as if aimed directly at her cage of diamond rings and polite silence. She pressed her lips together, shoulders trembling, as though the sound might split her in two. Mr. Lee sat motionless, his wife beside him. They exchanged no words, only a glance, sharp, calculating. They were not charmed by wealth's spectacle nor fooled by the trappings of power. What they saw was a fissure opening in the marble facade of the Blackwood Empire. Lara's own body shook with adrenaline. Every nerve screamed for her to stop, to retreat back into the shadows where she belonged. But she pushed harder, her soprano swelling until it wrapped the entire ballroom in a sound no one could ignore. She saw Julian's face flush with anger, Eleanor's pale with fury, Richard's gray with something far more dangerous, recognition. And she knew. She knew. Her mother's words echoed in memory. He called it the willow's lament. Said I was the willow tree, graceful, bending, but never breaking. Now, before the richest family in the city, Lara sang not as a servant, but as Maria's daughter, carrying the truth like a blade hidden in a melody. And oh, the willow weeps for you. Its branches cry for what was true. The last note of the verse sliced through the silence, sharp and unrelenting. The chandeliers quivered above as though the sound itself had weight. And when she opened her eyes, Lara's gaze went straight to Richard Blackwood. His lips were parted, his glass fallen, red wine spreading like blood across the white cloth. For the first time that evening, the titan of finance looked less like a conqueror and more like a man cornered by his own past. The silence that followed Lara's verse was heavier than any applause. It wasn't the silence of polite society pausing between toasts. It was the stunned hush of people realizing the ground beneath their feet was shifting. Even the chandeliers seemed to stop their glittering, as though reluctant to interrupt. Lara drew a breath, her chest heaving, her throat raw, and stepped closer to the edge of the stage. Her eyes scanned the room, but she did not see gowns or tuxedos, diamonds or polished shoes. She saw cages. She saw people who thought themselves free, yet bound by rules of power and silence just as surely as she had been. And in that moment, her fear dissolved into something steadier. She was not a waitress on display. She was a witness. The melody rose again, her soprano trembling at first, then gaining strength, the notes climbing like a bird that realized the bars had been left open. You traded songs for gold and steel, and left a wound that will not heal. Richard Blackwood's hand convulsed around his fork, the silver clattering softly against the plate. The words hit him like fists, every syllable an indictment. The storm of memories battered at him. Maria's laughter, the warmth of her cheek against his, the night he promised her that the song meant forever. Then the oak-paneled office of Eleanor's father, the gleaming contract laid before him, and the quiet, brutal demand. Choose. He had chosen. And the choice had chased him into this ballroom, dressed in his own blood. Eleanor's fury snapped through the tension. She leaned across the table, her voice low but audible. Richard, end this. Now her manicured nails dug crescents into his arm. This is humiliation. Do something, but Richard sat frozen, eyes fixed on Lara as though she were a ghost come to claim him. His lips moved, barely audible, shaping a name that had lived locked behind his teeth for decades. Maria. Julian, desperate to reclaim control, surged to his feet. Enough! His voice cracked like a whip across the room. She's an employee. A servant. Security. Remove her at once. The crowd stirred, whispers breaking like waves against marble walls. Yet no guard moved. Even the staff, trained to obey without question, stood rooted, transfixed by the song. Lara's eyes flicked briefly to Julian, then back to Richard. Her voice cut across his son's command, rich and resonant. But like the willow, I remain, and whisper your forgotten name. The name was unspoken in the lyric, but everyone in the room felt it land. Richard flinched visibly, shoulders folding inward. His empire had faced market crashes, hostile takeovers, even government investigations, but nothing had ever unraveled him like this. A melody from a woman he had betrayed, sung now by the daughter he had abandoned. Isabella de la Cruz sat frozen, tears tracking silently down her face. She looked at Julian, his jaw clenched in rage, his fists trembling, then back at Lara, whose defiance poured through every note. Isabella's heart pounded with recognition. She too was trapped in gilded chains, bartered away for a merger dressed as marriage. Lara's song was not just confession, it was revelation. It was hers, too. Mr. Lee leaned toward his wife, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp. He whispered in Korean, "A man whose house is built on lies cannot build with us." Mrs. Lee nodded, her lips pressed tight. Their verdict was already forming. The song reached its final verse, Lara's voice climbing until the air itself seemed to vibrate. "And still the willow weeps with me. Its roots remember what must be." Her last note lingered, long and crystalline, before dissolving into silence. For one suspended heartbeat, no one breathed. Then Richard's wine glass slipped from his grip, shattering against the floor. Red liquid spread across the carpet like a wound. The spell broke. Gasps erupted. Murmurs surged into shouts. Dozens of phones lifted into the air, screens glowing, capturing the moment a dynasty cracked. Eleanor shot to her feet, diamonds flashing like ice under firelight. "Lies!" she shrieked, her voice shrill enough to pierce the chandeliers. "She's nothing, a gutter rat, trying to blackmail us." "Richard, tell them she's lying." But Richard did not deny. His lips trembled, his face a ghastly canvas of guilt and recognition. And when his eyes lifted to Lara's once more, the truth leaked out in a single broken whisper, just loud enough for those nearest to hear. Maria. The name rolled through the air like a confession, carried by the stunned silence of those who caught it. It was the sound of a fortress door swinging open, revealing the rot within. Julian's voice faltered into panic. "Father, stop this nonsense. She's manipulating you. He broke off, seeing the expression in Richard's eyes. It wasn't manipulation. It was memory. It was ruin. The Lees rose quietly from their seats. Mr. Lee adjusted his tie with deliberate calm. "This partnership is over," he said, his voice cold enough to still the chaos around him. Then he turned, leading his wife toward the exit. Their departure was a verdict far heavier than any shouted accusation. Billions of dollars walked out the door with them. The ballroom dissolved into a frenzy of whispers, outrage, and the frantic clicking of cameras. The Blackwood Empire had been struck, not by a hostile takeover, but by a song. And Lara Vance, still standing on the stage, her chest rising and falling, her hands trembling around the microphone, realized the fire inside her had finally broken through. The Serafina Club's chandeliers glowed like captured suns, each crystal arm dripping with light. The room pulsed with chatter, forks clinking against porcelain, champagne bubbling as though the night were meant only for triumph. But Lara Vance felt her chest tighten with every second. Her humiliation at the Blackwood table had not faded. It clung to her like spilled wine, a sticky shame she could not wash off in the staff corridor. She stood again near the ballroom's entrance, her tray set aside, watching them. The family who had treated her as a toy, who had turned her life into spectacle. Julian Blackwood's smirk still burned in her memory. The deliberate trip, the spilled champagne staining his mother's silk, the way they had laughed at her as though she were less than human. And Eleanor's voice, shrill and venomous, still rang in her ears. It was more than mockery. It was dismissal, erasure, the kind of cruelty that told her she would never matter. Yet standing there now, with the music swelling from the jazz trio, she felt something crack inside. Not the fragile crack of breaking, the sharp crack of awakening. The air smelled of lilies and perfume, thick and cloying, the scent of wealth disguising rot. She touched the locket at her throat, her mother's keepsake, and thought of Maria Vance's voice, soft but steady, even in illness. "Ben, don't break," her mother always said. But tonight, Lara realized bending had gone on too long. Julian caught her eye again from across the table, and like a boy poking at a chained dog, beckoned her closer with a single arrogant finger. She obeyed, because that was what was expected, but she walked not with submission but with a gathering storm inside her. He leaned back, voice pitched loud enough for the room. "Tell me, waitress, what does someone like you dream of? Bigger tips? A fresh uniform? Or do you aim higher, like the ritzier broom closet?" Laughter rolled around the table, sharp as broken glass. Isabella looked down, shame heating her cheeks. Lara did not flinch. She looked at Richard Blackwood instead, the patriarch at the head of the table, his eyes cold, his jaw set. And then she spoke, voice clear, carrying farther than she expected. "I dream of a time when worth isn't measured by a suit's price tag. I dream of songs that tell the truth." The laughter died, as though someone had clapped their hands over it. Eleanor hissed, "A songbird in the gutter? Do you even carry a tune, girl? Or is that just another clumsy fantasy?" The words landed like a dare. Lara's pulse thundered in her ears, but beneath it came an unexpected calm. She thought of her mother's story about the Willow's Lament, a song written by a man named Rick long before she was born, a man with a guitar and a poet's soul, a man she had never met. So she smiled, a quiet, dangerous smile. "Yes," she said simply, "I can." And before anyone could stop her, she turned and walked towards the stage. The room stirred in disbelief. Waitstaff froze with trays midair. Guests leaned forward, whispering, phones twitching toward cameras, though no one dared raise them yet. The jazz trio, packing up their instruments, paused in confusion as Lara ascended the 2 shallow steps. Each footstep felt like thunder in her body. The chandeliers blurred in her vision. She gripped the microphone from its stand. The cool metal steadied her trembling hands. A hush spread, thick and electric, the kind of silence that expects either a miracle or a disaster. Julian chuckled behind her. What now? A dramatic reading? Maybe a juggling act? But his voice carried nervous edges, as though even he sensed something had shifted. Eleanor muttered furiously to Richard, "Do something. Stop this madness." But Richard did not move. His gaze was fixed on Lara, a faint line etched between his brows, something caught between annoyance and unease. Lara closed her eyes. She pictured her mother's face, young again, telling her about the man who once wrote a song as a promise. She remembered the words, "The willow bends, but does not break." And then she sang. The first note rose pure and sharp, startling in its clarity. It sliced through perfume, through murmurs, through arrogance. It was no timid sound. It was a voice trained in secret, polished by passion and grief. A soprano that could have filled a concert hall. Guests gasped, chairs scraped, the notes swelled into melody, haunting, mournful, alive. It was the willow's lament. The lyrics unfurled like silk. The willow bends beneath the storm, a promise whispered to keep me warm. You said our love was river strong, but rivers wander, and you are gone. Richard Blackwood's hand tightened around his wine glass until it trembled. He knew that song, knew it like he knew the rhythm of his own heartbeat. A life he had buried roared back. He was no longer in the glittering ballroom, but in a cramped apartment, rain tapping against cracked windows. Maria's laughter floated, and his guitar strummed under restless fingers. He had been Rick then, not Richard, the man who dreamed of music, not mergers. The voice on stage carried him deeper. And oh, the willow weeps for you, its branches cry for what was true. You traded songs for gold and steel, and left a wound that will not heal. His breath caught. The wineglass slipped, landing with a dull thud, crimson spilling across the linen like blood. Eleanor hissed in alarm, reaching for him, but he barely heard her. Every lyric was a blade. He remembered the day he chose ambition over Maria, over love. The office heavy with cigar smoke, Eleanor's father offering him wealth in exchange for abandoning the life of a struggling musician. He had taken the deal. He had silenced the music, and now, decades later, the song he'd written as a promise returned as a verdict. Lara's voice climbed higher, fierce, unstoppable. But like the willow I remain, I whisper your forgotten name. Through rain and storm, through years untold, your silence speaks, your love grew cold. Gasps scattered through the room. Even those who did not understand the history felt the truth in her voice. Isabella's tears shimmered in the candlelight. Guests who had come for gossip sat stunned, unable to look away. Richard's face was ashen, sweat beading on his temples. His empire, his reputation, everything he had built, none of it shielded him now. He could not buy silence from the past. The final note soared like a blade of light, suspended, trembling, and then fading into silence. The room did not breathe. For a heartbeat, nothing existed but Lara, the microphone, and the truth she had sung into being. She lowered the mic, her chest heaving, eyes locked on Richard Blackwood, and she spoke. That song is called The Willow's Lament. It was written long ago for my mother, Maria Vance, by a man who once called himself Rick. The room erupted, not with applause but with whispers sharp as knives. Eleanor froze, her face draining of color. Julian stared as though the ground had vanished beneath him. But Richard? He simply sat there, hollowed out, the ghost of Rick rising inside him. The silence that followed Lara's revelation was not the silence of awe but of rupture. It was the brittle hush that comes right before glass shatters. 100 conversations strangled themselves in throats. Forks hovered above plates, champagne bubbles broke noiselessly at the rims of crystal flutes, and every eye in the Serafina Club fastened on the young woman on the stage, the waitress who had just torn the mask from the city's most powerful family. Eleanor Blackwood reacted first. She shot up from her chair, the diamonds at her neck flashing like icicles catching firelight. Her voice cracked into the quiet like a whip. Lies, vicious lies. This girl is nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing. An opportunist from the gutter, clawing for a moment in the light. Richard, say something. Tell them it isn't true. But Richard didn't speak. His face was gray. The proud line of his jaw slackened, his eyes fixed on Lara, as if she were both judge and ghost. His lips moved, barely audible, shaping a single name. Maria. Those who heard it gasped. The confession was not shouted, but it needed no volume. In that one word, the truth was undeniable. Julian pushed back his chair so hard it screeched across the marble. "This is absurd. You're letting a servant humiliate us." His fury looked like strength, but his voice betrayed a crack, panic creeping in where confidence once lived. Lara stood tall beneath the golden lights. Her palms trembled, but her voice was steady. "My mother raised me alone. She told me stories about a man who wrote her a song, a man with a guitar and dreams bigger than his courage. She called him Rick. The world knows him as Richard Blackwood." The room gasped again, the sound like a storm rattling the chandeliers. Eleanor lunged toward her husband, clutching the lapels of his tailored tuxedo, her voice ragged. "Deny it! For God's sake, Richard, deny it before they tear us apart." Her fingers dug so hard that threads snapped, but Richard sat limp, eyes hollow. Phones were raised now, recording, flashing. The scandal was no longer a whisper among elites. It was becoming evidence. Julian spun towards the crowd, desperation in his eyes. "You don't believe this, do you? She's manipulating you. She tripped, spilled champagne, and now she's inventing some fantasy to punish us." But even as he shouted, Isabella rose from her seat. The diamond on her finger glittered under the chandeliers, but her expression had shifted from meek compliance to something unyielding. Her hands trembled as she slid the ring free. She set it on the table, right beside the spreading stain of Richard's spilled wine. The jewel winked obscenely, like a treasure pulled from wreckage. Her voice was calm, almost tender. "Julian," she sang of trading songs for gold and steel. "That's what this engagement is. Not love, a transaction. And I refuse to be another contract in your family's ledger." Julian's face drained of color. "Isabella, don't do this." "Not here." But Isabella had already turned. She crossed the room toward the stage, her heels clicking a steady rhythm against the parquet. The crowd parted instinctively. She climbed the steps and stood beside Lara, their eyes meeting. One woman who had risked everything to tell the truth, another who had found courage in its echo. "Thank you," Isabella whispered. "You're saving yourself," Lara answered, her throat tight but steady. Mr. Lee, the man whose signature could have sealed billions into the Blackwood empire, rose slowly from his seat. His face was composed, but his eyes glittered with quiet thunder. He adjusted the knot of his tie and addressed the room, his voice carrying with measured authority. "In my world," he said evenly, "business is not merely about wealth. It is about honor. A man who abandons his most sacred commitments cannot be trusted to honor his professional ones. Tonight, I have witnessed cruelty, deceit, and shame. I see no integrity here, and without integrity, there can be no partnership." He turned, his wife rising beside him, and together they walked toward the doors. The guests parted silently, as though a king and queen were leaving a battlefield. Their exit was not dramatic. It was devastating. It was the sound of billions walking away. The remaining investors knew what that meant. A merger crumbling was one thing. Honor evaporating in front of the city's eyes was another. Murmurs swelled. Sell the stock, cut ties, distance yourself. The Blackwood name was collapsing faster than any market could measure. Eleanor, wild-eyed, shrieked after them. "This isn't over. We still have power. We still—" But her voice faltered as she looked around. No one was listening. The Waitress ballroom had turned cold, its guests recalculating loyalties with the precision of accountants tallying losses. Richard slumped in his chair, staring not at the crowd, but at Lara. He saw Maria in her eyes, heard Maria in her voice, and felt the weight of decades crush him. The empire he had built to escape his past had become the stage on which that past returned to condemn him. Julian stood rigid, fists clenched at his sides, his polished veneer cracking. He glanced at Isabella, who stood tall beside Lara, and saw his own reflection not in her eyes, but in the contempt with which she no longer bothered to hide. For the first time, he wondered what the Blackwood name meant when stripped of fear and wealth. The answer chilled him. Nothing. Mr. Davies, the club manager, appeared at the edge of the stage. His usually stooped posture was now upright, his voice surprisingly firm. "Miss Vance is no longer an employee here," he declared, glaring at the security men inching forward. "She has resigned. And I won't allow her or her guests to be touched. Not tonight, not in my house." The guards hesitated, caught between the orders of power and the strange conviction of a man who had found his own backbone. Lara, chest still heaving, looked across the ballroom one last time. The empire of the Blackwoods, gleaming in crystal and orchids, lay cracked open like a rotten fruit. She tightened her grip on the microphone and spoke not to them, not to the cameras, but to herself, though her words carried to every corner. Honor isn't for sale. It isn't sewn into silk or poured into champagne. It's what you do when no one expects you to. Tonight, I chose to speak. She lowered the microphone, set it gently back on its stand, and walked off the stage. Isabella followed. Behind them, chaos exploded. Voices shouting, cameras flashing, Eleanor screaming, Julian raging, Richard whispering the same name over and over, Maria. But the women did not look back. The chandeliers still burned, but the light felt different now, less like triumph, more like exposure. The night that was meant to crown the Blackwoods had instead stripped them bare. And in the silence left by a song, the empire began to crumble. The morning after felt like the city had grown new eyes. Billboards still flashed advertisements, taxis still honked with their usual fury, and steam still puffed from manholes. But there was a difference, a hush beneath the clamor, the sensation that everyone was turning their heads toward the same story. Newspapers slapped against kiosks carried the headline in bold letters, "The Willows lament, a waitress brings down the Blackwoods." Some called it scandal, others justice, and a few with flair for drama called it prophecy. But whatever the label, it was everywhere, splashed across breakfast counters, murmured over bagels, dissected on live television. The Serafina Club had been a fortress of old money and old rules. Now it was a crime scene of reputation, and the tape around it was ink and gossip. Lara woke to the hiss of her radiator and the weight of exhaustion heavy in her bones. Her small apartment smelled faintly of mint tea and last night's rain drifting in from the cracked window. For once she hadn't dreamed of bills piling like storm clouds. Instead, she had dreamed of silence, a silence earned not by submission, but by release. On the couch, Isabella stirred beneath a borrowed blanket. Her makeup was smeared, her hair undone, yet she looked freer than she had all night in diamonds. She sat up, blinking at the light filtering through blinds. "Did it really happen?" she whispered, voice raw. Lara poured tea into two mismatched mugs and handed one over. The steam curled between them. It happened, and the world saw it. They sat together in the small kitchen, the linoleum cool under bare feet, sipping quietly as the city outside carried their names into its bloodstream. At the Blackwood penthouse, silence had a different texture. Eleanor Blackwood faced a mirror framed in guilt, her reflection fractured by tears she refused to shed. Phones buzzed with calls from lawyers, advisors, journalists, all ignored or barked at. She was a woman sculpted from ice, but even ice cracks under pressure. Julian had locked himself in his suite, shades drawn. The light of a tablet screen cast his face in a sickly glow as he scrolled headline after headline, each one carving deeper into his pride. He poured whiskey at noon, telling himself it was to dull the noise, though it only sharpened it. And Richard no longer carried himself like a titan. He wandered from room to room, pausing at photographs long ignored. He touched the glass frames as though they might anchor him. But the images only reflected a hollow truth. Wealth was scaffolding, and it had collapsed. His empire had been built to bury Rick, the man with the guitar. Now Rick had clawed back to the surface, dragged there by a daughter's voice. At Blackwood Capital, the board convened in grim suits. Share prices had plummeted 23% in a single day. Investors were calling for blood. The Lees had released their statement. No business can be conducted without trust. The words carried the weight of 1,000 contracts, each one evaporating like steam in the morning air. The chairman adjusted his glasses and spoke for the room. "Mr. Blackwood, we have no choice. For the protection of our shareholders, the board requests your immediate resignation." Richard's hands, once steady enough to sign deals worth billions, trembled slightly. He didn't argue. He didn't even lift his head. "I'll sign the papers," he murmured. And just like that, the man who had been untouchable was removed not with a scandalous arrest, but with a pen stroke. Laura watched it unfold on the evening news, sitting cross-legged on her floor, Isabella beside her. The image of Richard escorted from his own building filled the television screen. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Richard said nothing. He looked like a man already in exile. "Do you pity him?" Isabella asked, her voice tentative. Laura considered, her fingers curled around her locket. "No," she said at last, "but I think he hears the song now. And maybe that's punishment enough." The calls began soon after. Record labels, eager producers, daytime talk shows. Some voices dripped with flattery, others with hunger. They all wanted to make Laura a spectacle, the waitress with the voice that toppled a dynasty. She sifted through them with Isabella's help. Isabella, surprisingly sharp when freed from the leash of the Blackwoods, answered calls, drafted statements, and shut down vultures with the precision of a born strategist. Together, the two women became a fortress for each other. Not every call was from opportunists. One came from a philanthropist who had once started with nothing and built an empire through grit. She offered to fund Maria Vance's care completely, transferring her to the best facility in the country. When Laura told her mother, Maria wept, not because of comfort gained, but because her daughter's courage had rewritten their future. A month later, an envelope arrived. Heavy paper, cream-colored, no return address. The handwriting was elegant, but shaky. Laura slid it open carefully. Inside was a letter. "Laura, there are no words in this language sufficient to undo the past. An apology from me is a hollow, insulting sound against the weight of what I abandoned. Once I told myself choosing ambition over love was strength. I see now it was weakness. Your mother was the melody of my life. I silenced it, and for 25 years I have lived in silence. You, with your voice, have brought the music back, even if it is a song of my ruin. I have lost everything built on lies. What remains I have placed into a trust. It cannot return the years or repair what I broke. But I beg you, use it to build something beautiful and true. Be the person I lacked the courage to become. I will not trouble you again. Rick. Folded inside was a legal deed, transferring what scraps of the Blackwood fortune remained into Laura's name. She read it twice, tears blurring the ink. It was not forgiveness. It was not reunion. It was surrender. And maybe, in its way, it was enough. That night, Laura visited her mother. Maria lay in her new room, sunlight spilling across clean sheets, herbs growing on a windowsill. She looked peaceful, as though years of struggle had finally loosened their grip. Laura sat by her bed and showed her the letter. Maria's hand shook as she touched the paper. "He was weak," she whispered. "But you were strong enough for us both." Laura kissed her mother's forehead. "I only sang what you already taught me." On the balcony of her small apartment, Laura stood alone later, the city sprawling at her feet like a restless animal. The night air smelled of rain and exhaust, alive and imperfect. She clutched the photograph of her mother, young and radiant, her locket pressing into her skin. She thought of Rick and Richard, of Maria, of the song that had ripped through walls built of marble and lies. She thought of Isabella asleep on her couch, of Mr. Davies standing like a shield, of strangers who now knew her name. And she realized dignity had no price tag. Honor did not come stamped on silk labels or written into contracts. It lived in the voice that spoke when silence was easier. The Blackwoods had crumbled under the weight of secrets. She had stepped into the wreckage with nothing but her voice. And left, carrying everything that mattered. The willow bent, but it did not break. And neither did she. Winter slid into the city quietly, like a thief swapping gold leaves for bare branches. The Serafina Club still stood 30 floors above the streets, but its glow had dimmed. Even palaces feel smaller after they've hosted revolutions. The tabloids called it the ballroom betrayal. Historians, if they cared, might one day call it something grander. Laura simply thought of it as the night she stopped being invisible. She no longer carried trays. Instead, she carried sheet music and notebooks filled with lyrics. Her days were structured by rehearsals, not shifts, and the smell that clung to her clothes was rosin from violin bows and dust from piano keys, not spilled champagne. The transformation still startled her. Sometimes she would catch her reflection in a shop window and half expect to see the uniform, the black flats, the practice smile. But instead she saw herself, clear-eyed, shoulders square, mouth curved with something dangerously close to confidence. Isabella had not returned to Julian. That door closed with a definitive slam, the kind that echoes across lifetimes. She moved into Laura's apartment at first, two women learning to share not just space, but survival. Isabella, once trained to smile silently through banquets, discovered she could laugh loudly over burnt toast. She answered reporters' calls with icy efficiency, negotiated performance offers, and kept opportunists at bay. What began as gratitude became friendship, and what began as friendship hinted at something sturdier, solidarity, the kind of alliance built not on contracts, but on scars healed together. Maria's health, though fragile, improved in her new facility. The nurses learned quickly that she preferred herbal tea to coffee and that she sang herself to sleep with half-remembered lullabies. When Laura visited, she often found her mother humming the opening bars of the Willow's Lament. Sometimes Maria cried. Sometimes she laughed at her own tears. Always she held Laura's hand with the grip of someone who finally believed her child would live lighter than she had. As for Richard Blackwood, Rick, he faded from the city like mist at sunrise. There were no indictments, only the slower punishment of irrelevance. Stripped of position, ignored by allies, avoided by investors, he retreated to some coastal estate bought long ago for its seclusion. Reporters camped for weeks, waiting for him to emerge, to rage, to deny. He never did. Perhaps he was still listening to the song echoing in his head. Perhaps silence, at last, was the only language left to him. Eleanor fought harder. She clawed at invitations, demanded relevance, tried to resurrect the empire through sheer volume. But money without trust is a skeleton with pearls. It rattles but does not move. She became a cautionary tale whispered in salons, the queen who mistook cruelty for control. Julian disappeared into luxury exile, Europe, then Asia, then nowhere anyone bothered to follow. The Blackwood name became a relic, less feared than pitied, stamped in footnotes rather than headlines. Laura's name, meanwhile, began to climb marquees. Her first performance was not in a gilded hall, but at a modest community theater. The seats creaked, the lights flickered, the programs were printed on cheap paper. But when she sang, the crowd leaned forward as though each note was a rope pulling them closer. The applause thundered, not for perfection, but for truth. And truth, she discovered, was always in season. Her repertoire expanded, but she always returned to the Willow's Lament. Each time, it carried new weight. For some, it was a ballad of lost love. For others, an anthem of betrayal. For Laura, it was a living inheritance. Her mother's wound, her father's confession, her own defiance braided into a melody that refused to die. One night, after an encore that left her throat raw, she stepped outside into the chill and found Mr. Davies waiting. The old manager still looked harried, tie crooked, hair thinning, but his smile was easier now. "You nearly gave me a heart attack that night," he told her, marching onto that stage. "But I've never been prouder to be wrong." Lara laughed, the sound surprising even her. "You taught me more than you know. How to keep my hand steady, even when my heart wasn't. That mattered when I held the mic." He nodded, eyes shining. "Your mother would be proud." "No, she already is." And with that, he melted back into the city, his role complete. The city loved to feast on downfall, but it adored rebirth even more. Articles called Laura the songbird of truth. Talk shows framed her as proof that courage still had currency. She learned to smile politely through interviews, to dodge questions that pried too hard, to laugh when strangers thanked her as though she had toppled an empire with a single note. In truth, she hadn't meant to topple anything. She had only refused to stay silent. Yet silence, she realized, is what builds empires of deceit. And refusal is what cracks them. Late one night, she sat on her balcony, Isabella asleep inside, the city glittering below like a restless sea. She held the letter Richard had sent, creased now from rereading. His words no longer stung. They lay like stones at the bottom of a river, smoothed by time, harmless. She thought of him as Rick, not Richard, a man who had once written love into a melody, and then chosen fear instead. She wondered if he listened still, if the song that undid him now played in his mind as prayer or punishment. Perhaps both. She whispered into the night, "I forgive you." Not for him, but for herself. Because forgiveness, she had learned, was not absolution. It was release. The wind carried her words away, scattering them among the neon and smog. She felt lighter, not because the past was gone, but because it no longer owned her. Years later, historians would still debate the Blackwood collapse. Economists would study its ripple effects on markets. Sociologists would trace its symbolism in the struggle between wealth and dignity. But for Lara, it was simpler. It was the night she sang. When she stood again on the stage of a packed concert hall, chandeliers blazing, air thick with expectation, she touched her locket before raising the microphone. She felt Maria's presence in the melody, Isabella's strength in the wings, Davies's encouragement in the silence before the note. She sang not to topple dynasties, but to remind herself that bending is not breaking, that silence can be shattered, and that even in rooms built to silence her, her voice could bloom. The Willow's lament had become her anthem. And as the final note soared and the crowd rose to its feet, Lara smiled through tears, certain of one thing. The song had outlived the empire, and so had she.